Hey, hello everyone. Welcome back. Um, this week we're looking at chapter 9 of Dawn of Everything, Hiding in Plain Sight: The Indigenous Origins of Social Housing and Democracy in the Americas. And in this chapter, the authors make a couple different arguments, one of which they've made throughout the book, and that is the idea that with the development of, of cities, there is not necessarily, along with that, a development of kings or necessarily of extreme hierarchy. And so they take their research to the Americas, where they show that there have been urban environments in the Americas that were able to survive for hundreds of years without any evidence of there being kings or hierarchical, disparate hierarchical rulers, where there's a wide gap between the commoners and the elite. And then the other argument that they develop in this chapter is the notion that democracy may have multiple origins. Of course, the conventional wisdom is that democracy as a political system dates to ancient Greece. Of course, those societies were slave societies, and yet they were societies that did develop a notion of the polis and the demos, etc. And what's so fascinating about this chapter is that the authors argue that prior to the arrival of Europeans, that there was already widespread experimentation with different kinds of rule in urban environments. And so they use three examples to make their case. And of course, like a lot of the reasoning elsewhere in the book, they are acknowledging the absence of evidence, but they aren't using that to draw conclusive conclusions about what may have happened, because they are trying to imagine alternate scenarios. And so when there's an absence of evidence, it doesn't prove that certain cultural forms didn't exist. It's just that there might not be evidence of that. And so they're asking the readers to imagine some of the possibilities that the evidence seems to indicate. So they start by looking at Teotihuacan, which is a settlement in central Mexico, where there are two enormous pyramids and a lot of uncertainty about, because of the lack of a historical record. What archaeologists do know is that Teotihuacan preceded the Aztec Empire. It's believed that around, or according to the authors, around the year 300, Teotihuacan went through an unexpected turn where the elite of the city seems to have been overthrown, or at least transformed in a way so that town resources were distributed more equitably. And what they find is that between the years 300 and 500 Common Era, that there was widespread creation, construction of what one of the archaeologists who's worked on this period has called social housing. And there's a fascinating map, of course, or diagram on page 339 that sketches out the plots, the different residences. And archaeologists, if you visit the site, you can actually walk through some of these quarters. And because I study Mexico, I've done it. It's amazing to see that these really, as you walk through them, they really feel like apartment complexes where as many as 100 families could have lived in circumstances that would have been largely egalitarian. After 500, the evidence suggests that there were dislocations, and it's suggested, it's introduced as a possibility that I love the way that they refer to a potential Teotihuacano freebooter who may have left, gone down south to the lowlands of Yucatan, and presented himself as a stranger king, and eventually became the king of Tikal. So this is a very hypothetical kind of situation, but what they're relying on is the evidence of Toltec features being found in southern Mexico. And the direction works in one way, where it's clear that people from central Mexico visited southern Mexico. And so the authors are building on some of David Graeber's work about how aristocracies take shape. And in the book that he did with Marshall Solins, he argues that one of the most conventional ways that kings take shape is by arriving from outside and then gaining legitimacy through whatever means that they're able to. This is a story that is sort of in a lot of the origin myths of a lot of the indigenous peoples of Mexico, that someone was had fallen into moral disrepute, was sent out, was exiled, would perhaps one day come back, or arrived at some other place in the guise of a stranger king for that community. So these are stories that have been told. What's fascinating about this chapter is the connections that they make across the span of time in a way that my understanding of the history of this period, it hasn't yet been done. So my own specialty is Mexico, contemporary modern Mexico, but of course, you know, I studied the colonial period. And when you study the colonial period for Mexico, even if you're studying the indigenous peoples, there is this artificial divide that gets made with the arrival of Europeans. And it's sort of a function of the intellectual discipline that splits history from archaeology. So there are very few scholars who have had the kind of synthetic scope that the two Davids have, who are able to connect these dots in ways that I think are really eye-opening, because typically modern history is benchmarked with 1492, with the arrival of Columbus, and the idea that the modern state system is a European derivation, and that a new phase of human history began in 1492. Basically, everyone works within that kind of a framework, because there's no denying that there were new contacts made and that there was a Columbian exchange. But what the two Davids do that I think is so important is that they show, one, that the state does not have Greek origins or necessarily Roman origins or Western origins. So there's that. The second is that the process of schismogenesis seems to have gone on in a way in the Americas, or what then became the Americas, to a level that scholars have not really taken notice of. And so in the next chapter, which is a huge chapter, they're going to talk about the city of Cahokia that was present in around 1200 and was overthrown, they argue, by egalitarian indigenous people, which means the indigenous people that the Europeans arrived were themselves the product of a schismogenetic process where they deliberately attempted to overthrow authoritarian regimes that preceded them. So this idea of the romantic noble savage is part of a function of the intellectual discipline of history, and this idea that a new phase necessarily started in 1492. So it actually restores a sense of history to the people themselves, because it gives them this sense of agency where there was not a unilinear path to statehood, and that in fact there were lots of civilizations that saw the direction that society was going and deliberately tried to put the brakes on those developments by walking away or overthrowing or dispersing, but coming together. And then the third example, so the second example they use is looking at the connections to the lowland Maya in Tikal. And then the third example is Tlaxcala. And Tlaxcala was an indigenous city-state that the evidence suggests lacked a king. Now, when I first learned about Tlaxcala, I was taught that there were kings, but that the kings, their royal function was to serve as poets. And so there is in the historiography still a tendency to call the elite of Tlaxcala kings, but they were kings that really had pretend power. And so it's nice seeing them make this connection to the kinds of deliberation that have been obscured by history. And their reading of Cervantes is of Salazar is especially fascinating, because they're able to give credence to the deliberations that went on. And these days, when people talk about the conquest of the Aztec, they, at least when I teach it, I'm just as likely to refer to it as an indigenous civil war as I am a conquest by the Spanish, because numerically speaking, the Spanish could not have done this without the Tlaxcalan allies. And so people wonder, how did 600 Spaniards do this? Well, they didn't. They did it with an army of the Tlaxcalans that was about 250,000 people strong, who had a lot of axes to grind. So the idea that a state has an origin, they'll go on to show, is not only wrong, but it's also wrong to think that once a state takes shape, that it only becomes stronger from then on, and that they show that in fact the alternate can be the case. But there are lots of explanations for, well, they don't really offer an explanation for why in 300 things turned and then why in 500 they turned again. But the importance of the chapter is showing that these turns are happening, and that they're happening through a schismogenetic process where people are consciously and deliberately making the decisions that affect their lives. So really wonderful to see them visit the Americas, because it helps confirm what I think is a general sociology, well, general anthropology that they're providing, that's showing that these forms don't necessarily have specific cultural origins. They might have human origins, but that they can play out in a myriad of ways. And so I found it really, really refreshing to hear about the kinds of deliberations that indigenous people engaged in when faced with a new people that they weren't sure where they came from. So I'd love to hear thoughts from people about their thoughts on this chapter, and I open it up to anyone who'd like to join in.
Yeah, maybe I will say if nobody wanted now. So I'm interested to continue conversation from the last reading group about technology, how technology affecting social changes and social design. Yeah, Michael has some amazing thoughts last time about this, but I just noticed that this chapter, they are talking again about a diverse agricultural practices. So it was agriculture, but hunting and also urban gardening and everything at once. And yeah, it looks like every place where people were happy and living good, they always have this diverse practicing. So we should actually do the same in our times. But then they didn't have any technological, they didn't have domestic animals. They didn't even have metal. So is the technology is really a problem? Looks like anytime anybody put their hands on technology, it's end up very badly. So maybe I will ask Michael directly to engage in conversation.
I mean, I suppose technologies are social relationships, and some types of technologies support some types of social relationships. If you argue, like, say, guns, germs, and steel is a big deal, well, guns have a pretty low level of power to develop consensus, but they have a pretty high level of power to develop slavery and kind of real threat. And in that sense, maybe guns are a technology that help your value system to shift into one particular direction. If you have a value system where you have horses and, if you have like horses and animal technologies, you're making cooperations where you can create particular types of labor that relieve a human from that labor. But it may also be quite valuable to say, look, all our labor has to be organized through human beings. And if it's not human beings if a bunch of human beings don't agree to doing it, then it can't happen. So that's another type of framework. I guess human labor is maybe a very valuable thing to think about today when we have a climate change crisis where a huge amount of the ability of certain groups of people to do things is because they have technologies that take fossil fuels and allow their model of what the society should be to be suddenly accomplished. If you want to do farming, you can have fossil fuel fertilizers and tractors and a low level of labor and a high level of capital investment, and then the return all goes to the small number of people who control it, rather than pay for labor and have a better amount of resources to come out of the soil. If you put a lot of labor and thought and agriculture into the soil, you can make that soil produce a lot more than if you just mass produce seeds that you throw out from a tractor and then throw fertilizer at it and then come back later in the year. And if you've got any problems with pests, you poison the whole place and hope that your poisons will only affect the one pest that you're looking for. That's a kind of technology that enables a particular type of thing. So, I don't think there's anything of saying that there's no such thing as technology. It's not a thing. There's technologies. There's lots of them. And they are social relations in that. And I think maybe like to draw the kind of technologies that are on the opposite side of here, what would be the technologies of social housing? What would be the technologies of building a temple? That temple in the first place that got burned out. And I wanted to ask Steve or other people here, the subtitle, Hiding in Plain Sight, the Indigenous Origins of Social Housing and Democracy in the Americas. It's not really, I didn't really, I've got to confess that I got caught up in a meeting for my union because it's going out on strike soon again. But like I didn't get the last bit finished, but it's not really an argument that social housing today as an argument, say, in the United Kingdom or other places is directly dependent upon this earlier case, or is it? because I just got curious, because obviously the argument about Kandaruk was that the Native Americans were directly a causal factor in the Western, like European excitement about constitutions and, oh my goodness, we must talk about how we will organize, how we will make decisions, and all this kind of endless debate was actually part of a previous endless debate that happened in the Iroquois nations. And it was probably part of a previous debate that happened when that Iroquois group and those nations pulled away from an earlier, in the central middle part of America's tribe, that a group that didn't have many debates about democracy. They just more had debates about, you do what we say because we're in charge and we're going to use violence. And those people decided not to do that. But is this also the subtitle? I just was questioning about the subtitle. Is there an argument here that social housing here has an influence on Europeans? I mean, certainly the democracy issue is that there is more than one origin of democracy. But I don't know, is there an argument that somewhere that democracy influenced other places, like Spain?
I don't think that's the argument that they're making. They are trying to rebut an argument that's been made that the Tlaxcalans, the people of the city-state who allied with Hernan Cortés against the Aztecs, there is an argument out there that the Tlaxcalans were inspired by the Europeans and the ability that the Europeans offered to escape domination by the Aztecs, and that the Tlaxcalans were inspired by European forms of government and therefore adopted councils, which in Spanish are known as ayuntamientos. That argument, though, is not a very strong one. And in fact, the book that they cite as the kind of lead book to make that argument is by Colin McLaughlin. He's really not a specialist in that era. So I don't know how strong. To me, that one kind of reads like a straw man argument, because I haven't really seen people, I have not seen a lot of work that makes the argument that the Tlaxcalans were inspired by the European forms of governance, and that's part of the reason why they developed in the direction that they did after Cortés. What they do get right is that there is a conventional wisdom that kind of social policy wasn't predominant in the New World prior to Columbus. And I think that's probably true, but I think it's also because so much of the research has been done on the Aztecs, and the Tlaxcalans deliberately define themselves against the Aztecs, or the Mexica as they're also known. So I haven't seen much evidence of people thinking that the Tlaxcalans were inspired by Europeans. But I think what they are trying to establish is that the indigenous people of the New World were able to think in politically creative ways and were able to implement social policy on a level that no European would have considered possible at the time. And that if you read the right sources, you can get some glimpses into that. And so when the chapter title, Hiding in Plain Sight, comes from an actual Spanish account from someone who was an academic who was inspired by Cortés's story, traveled to the New World, interviewed Cortés's children, and then started writing this history that included a more detailed understanding of the Tlaxcalans. So they're using that account to show that the Tlaxcalan version of democracy was hiding in plain sight. and then the kind of social policy, housing policy from, let's see, that would have been 1,000 years earlier, 1,000 years earlier in Teotihuacan, that kind of sophisticated political thought also predated the Europeans.
They also mentioned that this is on page 355, that the assumption is that like indigenous people picked up democracy from European encounters, but at that moment in history, Europeans weren't really all that excited about democratic values themselves either. So it's hard to make that leap that the indigenous people picked up democratic values from Europeans when in fact democratic values within Europe in other side, like in various European societies at the time, didn't really abide by that. And maybe it's us in today's time, or like in more recent history, we've taken up this lens of the noble savage that is being educated by Europeans. And perhaps like it says over here, if anyone was learning something new from the encounter, it was surely the Spanish, who were looking at their ways of having councils and experts discussing and debating what decisions to make and bringing everyone on board.
Could I ask Steve one question? Because they mentioned in the book that they didn't have metallurgy at all. And at the same time, when they quote that little passage from I don't remember the name, the man who was opposed to allying with the Spaniards, he mentions that the Spanish wanted gold and silver. So
right, those are metals. So what does it mean that they didn't have metallurgy?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, and please correct me because I could be wrong, so if someone else knows better. It's my sense that when they talk about metallurgy, that they're talking about the creating alloys. So the mixture of metals to then create stronger metals. It's absolutely true that the Aztec, the Tlaxcalan, the Inca had silver and gold, and they used them ornamentally. They did ascribe social value to those items, not in the same way that Europeans did, of course. But it was restricted to those sorts of metals. So for instance, the weapons that the Aztecs used, they used obsidian, rock, lava rock, hardened lava rock. But what's interesting is that there were other civilizations in the Americas that did work with metals, like the peoples of Cahokia in the 1200s off the Mississippi. And so my guess is that the societies that didn't practice metallurgy, it's possible that they were unaware and that sort of historical memory wasn't passed along. But it's also possible that, like certain technologies that can have profound social consequences, it's possible that they may have deliberately rejected those technologies because of what it could allow people to do. I mean, I honestly, I don't know. But
so there's never been any evidence of knives, even like cooking knives. I'm just thinking how you would cook or clean a fish if you don't have any metal to do it with. Probably hard to do it with rock.
Well, but obsidian rock are like knives.
Okay.
And in fact, it's obsidian spears is how they would pierce the chest of victims for human sacrifice. And so they would pierce the chest, pull out the heart, and that was all done with sharpened obsidian even. So they were, yeah, I mean, that's basically how they did it.
I'm going to share something. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the work of Martin Prechtel, but he actually is from our time, and he has a lot to say about technology and how indigenous people from his people use technology for knives specifically. I'm going to share it now in the chat.
I think there was a bit of a confusion here. I don't think that they're talking about metal in general. They're talking about steel, because I mean that's Jared Diamond's argument that the Spanish conquistadors won because they had steel, especially when they talk about the Inca wars. They had steel, and this meant that the armors of the Inca was completely inefficient against steel. That's why they won. I mean, this is Diamond's argument. And what they try to do in this chapter, and I think it's explicitly anti-Jared Diamond chapter, they try to change the focus from technology, from germs as well, because the Tlaxcala is actually mentioned by Diamond, but what they say is that this civilization completely disappeared because of the disease that the European brought there. So this is something mentioned. But so what they try to do is that they try to change the focus from technology to democracy.
Meaning that technology is not so important, or meaning that deliberate choice of certain technologies is making democracy?
I think that this is not that important. I mean, Jared Diamond's book is only revolving around that. This is only about technology, and this is what basically led the whole history. And I think what David Graeber is trying to do here is to talk about. I mean, this is an argument that he made a while ago in this very nice essay that is called "There Was Never a West," and his argument is basically saying that we didn't invent democracy, and it is possible it actually comes, as Michael was saying, it has multiple origins, and in this one he mentions the Tlaxcalan. We also mention again Kondiarong, and this is actually a really nice paragraph where he says that Kondiarong was actually it was like some sort of an ancient Greek example, because he was using kind of the same rhetoric, and they're like, oh, maybe we actually told him about these Greek authors, and he just like repeated them for fun. Now so there is, again, it's dialogic thing with there is a conversation, and these people were quite good at picking things up, and this is it goes back to what Hassan was saying.
Yeah,
and also
go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, it might also be, I mean, to look at in terms of the modern Western mythology is about the efficiency in the economy and who's valuable and who's not. And you can look at a lot of the technologies that are made are organized around particular relationships that mean the people who use those technologies gain a competitive advantage but in some way dominate the global economy. And those technologies, in some sense, you might look at them as in the kind of conflict of values, like how does, if the value of any exchange is a kind of performative experience, everybody performs the value of the world that they want to live in, how do particular technologies enable this type of victory in those performances? And obviously, steel is in some ways able to use violence in that. And so, but like many of our technologies today are also about, in some ways, control a situation that then becomes a bureaucratic experience. You know, what's the relationship between technology, violence, and bureaucracy? Technologies that dominate the social relations create a sort of law that happens there. So there might be some kind of continuum there. It's not really in, you know, per se relevant to this chapter, but that's maybe like also this chapter kind of is a little foothold on undermining this story of the West, as Vasily is saying, and that technology is somehow the great liberation of the West is part of the mythology of the West when they've used technology to be in control of other people. But I don't think that techniques or use of material objects is necessarily bad. I mean, what counts as a technology? All kinds of things like agriculture and having a very effective, people today often talk about the steppe agriculture in the Andes as an amazing set of techniques to be really effective in a difficult place to grow food, and is very effective. And that is a technique or as a collective framework of a technology, you know, is that, you know, whereas, you know, so the emphasis on what a technology is, you know, we might shift that to other types of social relations, techniques or technologies that enable a cooperative value system or effective resolution of conflicts.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on Vasily's point about this chapter being a critique of Jared Diamond. One of the things that Diamond argues is, you know, he spends a great deal of time talking about what the West did to the indigenous peoples, and of course it had to do with germs and steel. But it's such a technological determinist argument that he basically presupposes that steel is an inherently superior technology to anything else, and that steel and disease is what explains the conquest of the Aztecs. He then tries to explain, well, why did the West develop steel? And one of the arguments that he makes there is has to do with the diet of people of the old world, that people of the old world ate a form of corn that had more caloric content than what was being eaten at the same time in the Americas. And he spends a bit of time kind of developing this argument that basically he's reducing entire civilizations down to their brain power based on their caloric intake, when the truth is the people of the Americas had abundantly robust diets, and if they didn't eat a kind of maize or corn like the Europeans, I don't see how that then left them off of this technological trajectory towards steel. But that's kind of one of the implications of his argument. And so seeing this as really a direct critique of Jared Diamond, I was thinking of it more as a sort of, a historical argument, connecting some dots that people hadn't really connected, and didn't really read this chapter as a critique of Diamond. But now with what Vasily has said, it's really, they're basically making this broader argument that these supposedly technologically inferior people were capable of a level of egalitarianism that Europe would have never even considered. And so it really kind of makes you wonder about the presuppositions that authors like Jared Diamond bring to their work, without asking the kind of more imaginative questions that the two Davids do, where they're willing to consider a variety of options based on evidence rather than one seemingly locomotive train to the present day. Mika?
Yeah, I want to now connect the question of changing social regimes with change of technology, because chapter from chapter, they describe how, like, oops, suddenly the citizens decided to change the social order, and somehow it's happened. So in my Soviet school, we were trained on this vulgar Marxism, where like the technological development and the social development were like, just like the social changes were determined by the technological development. So obviously it's not like that. Now with hopefully with David's books, it's will be obvious to everyone, but still it's a big question for me how the technology is creating domination and how it's not. For example, it's clear for me that nuclear technology, like it is the way to creating domination, because it's not probably now they can make this nuclear station be more or less not so dangerous, but still you have to protect these places. It's a central power. Then you have to create the distribution system that has come from the one place. So the solar panels or any of the other smaller technology, they are like much less coming to organize the dominance. But I also think that technology could be changed. For example, Michael was talking before about guns as an absolutely bad technology that is definitely creating social domination. And I once heard this lecture of the trendy German artist Hita Steyer about guns. And it was very convincing how she described how invention of the guns actually democratize violence. And that's how actually America was born. Because previously you have, this big weapon that only king can afford. And suddenly you have these all these cowboys who has their own guns. And we saw it's all in this American westerns where, the trained guy can kill anybody. And so that's how the spread of the Americans went, and they separated from the Great Britain. So I just wonder if we can change this technology, any technology, and reuse them for the different social purposes. So the technology itself is not fixed. So if, like Stephen was saying, that ARTSEC was using the stones, I don't remember the name, for like evil purposes of extracting human organs, and they didn't need the real like steel for that. So maybe we can use bad technology for good purposes and a good technology for bad purposes. Maybe that's also a shiftable thing.
Yeah, I mean, I have a gun, a pistol, and when I pull the trigger, it's a cigarette lighter. Sorry.
I mean, I think that would be, most people would look at technologies as within that social context. And so as the social context changes, the use of the technology could change. And also as a social context changes, people might choose or build or use different technologies. If you look at firearms, firearms were an important part of protecting Kurdistan as a nation that was as a people that was facing violent and racial destruction, right? So, I mean, one would hope that you don't need guns to defend your culture, but they might be part of that. There's an old, kind of an old joke, but it's got a certain resonance, which is about anarchist movements, socialist movements, left movements are always saying, oh, we need to support this, but you always have this problem, oftentimes a problem, particularly in Western culture, with when men are involved, they have some kind of problems with sexism or whatnot. And people can say, well, shouldn't we have a kind of a demand that all the men be really, really think about what they do and make decisions that are important, and we need to convince all these men to do that. And then another approach, when, you know, as a joke, people, anarchists might say, oh, actually, let's just tell the men they can do whatever they want. But we're handing out all the women submachine guns. The women are taking up submachine guns, and they can make and do what they want, right? And then all of a sudden the men decide, well, it's actually quite in my interest to not be sexist, right? And it's a slightly different thing, is that, you know, it's not about, oh, let's the powerful people who are men behave themselves. Let's make sure people have equal power, and then it will make sense to behave yourself because you thing. When I was in London, I first came to London, the squatting scene had very powerful group of women, not powerful in the sense that they could punch you or tell you something, but they did a lot of the organizing that held together the training sessions and helped people get housing. And if you were like homeless, that's a bad scene. And so one suddenly said like, oh, wow, being against sexism is not just an academic thing. I bet I'm actually going to make sure that I don't slip up. Otherwise, I'm in trouble with, it could be trouble less. It must make me harder for housing. So those are different ways to think about that. I don't know how many of that. I'd be interested to know, like, when you have like these social housing that they talk about, there's actually a specific decision, or we don't know, because right, it's the archaeology. And people are judging all of these houses are equal, right? You know, I mean, I suppose you could have all your houses equal and one family gets to have 3 houses and another family only gets to have 1, right? And then you could use the same technology to have a different type of social relationship. But so it's always a question about how much you can judge from the actual material culture. And I don't know how archaeologists argue about that, but like, but it is a kind of plain and simple way. Oh, the houses are all of equal size. Maybe the families are all equal. They are, okay. I mean, they are arguing that the kings have a very distinct way of being, and all these kings have the same thing. I bet you could probably find, if you went another layer deeper, you might be able to find kings that exist in ways that look like democracy. You dig them up, and like, you know, and we've all been to meetings that are very, very democratic, or that it's organized, and you realize actually when you get to the center of the spiral, these people are running things. You know what I mean? And that might be to the benefit of everybody, but it's
that's
not.
The West.
Yeah. So I mean, those are just a couple of things to make think about how, like, I just wonder what people think about the city. I mean, the city that doesn't even really have a name. It's called city. What is it called? The City of the Moon, or City of the God, the Pyramid of the Moon, the Pyramid of the God. And then at some point, the pyramids are no longer developed, but they still have them. One of them gets burnt out, and then you have these houses, and exactly how the argument that do you need for equality, do you need equal houses, or is it just easier?
I think about this a lot, and I'm trying to write about it. And basically, I think what it comes down to, which is something that is ignored in the West, because you can't very well dig it up, is the culture and the rituals and the mythology, and how all of that develops the psyche of the entire culture, so that people do not end up killing each other or hungering for power or doing any of these things. This is very difficult for us in the West to acknowledge, because we don't do any of these things. I mean, we tell children that hitting other children is bad, but that's where it stops. When you look at China, for instance, they go the extra mile to ensure that, to instill these values of cooperation and, you know, doing things for the benefit of the group. So my guess is that these ancient people, I can't pronounce the name, would have had something like that. And if you look at this interview that I'm sharing, Martin Prechtel explains how in his group of people, the shaman would have to create a knife to ensure that it would not be used for violence. And exactly how do you do that? Well, you have to gift the gods, I think it is, you have to gift everything, you have to give them something of equal value to the knife. And if you go through all of that process in order to produce one knife to ensure that it's not used for violence, then you can imagine how many knives you're going to have, like a limited number, because each one takes so much time. But it's embedded in the culture, the use of the knife, it's embedded into the production of the knife, and it's embedded into the mythology of the group. And so violence is far less likely. Let's see if we could, I particularly like that quote from the old man who was 100 years old and blind, because he could read the Spaniards straight away. It's not difficult when you look at the way they behaved with their bottomless appetite for gold and silver and pearls, and they would eat everything, and they would sleep in their own clothes. Those are people who are not right here. And so of course they would have behaved in the way that they ended up behaving. But always listen to the old.
Yeah, one of the things that continues to strike me about this book is every chapter seems to have a moment or a section where there isn't a lot of detail because the archaeological record is spotty, but that something happened where the elite went too far in terms of pressing demands against the people, and there was some kind of moral reaction, and because human economies are moral economies, and that there's then this conscious rejection or refusal or toppling. And every chapter seems to have sort of a spot where people kind of say, in Spanish it would be ya basta, enough already. But the details aren't really provided because they can't really access them. But I keep reading it as these reminders that we can put a stop to the things that are going on that we don't like seeing, but that this will take a very large concerted effort of a lot of people turning their backs on life as they know it, or nurturing new social relations that look very different in this shell that we're finding. So it to me it's a kind of, it's a hopeful book, even though they're talking about things that happened thousands of years ago. I think they're hoping it to be almost this like fountainhead where we can go and sort of find how we could have been and maybe still are. We've gotten stuck. And so it's it crosses so many geographies and so many temporal scales, and yet it keeps reiterating the same message that humans have the power to creatively refuse, and that we cannot lose sight of that.
Steve?
Yeah,
I think it was also, they had the direction going the other way too, and Teotihuacan, I can't pronounce it very well, but at the end of the city, I mean, they had different ethnic groups, and they're mentioning one of the ethnic groups was a little bit more violent than the other. I mean, they discovered skulls, and it's sort of like just like a thought experiment, or just like a seed for thought, that maybe you have to do something else about differing ethnicities within a large city like that. And it sounded like maybe something went wrong there too. Another hint that at that level, maybe there's some things that we should take into account. I mean, that's actually going the other way too. It's not the basta way, but we've gotten to this level, but there are too many ethnicities without an overarching maybe mission or something. And they just sort of hint at it, and they've done it before, as you mentioned in other chapters. It just it really gives us so much to think about. And it's so not just facts, but it's actually helping our imaginations, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's thinking of the title, you know, The Dawn of Everything. It's such a kind of a, you know, a cheeky title, but because Graeber's epistemology is rooted in constituent imagination, they are asking us as we read to sort of to create our own, to allow our own imaginations to sort of expand so that we can do these kinds of thought experiments that they're suggesting are really necessary if we want to consider where we are right now as a dawn of humanity and leaving behind humanity's childhood. Because basically they're saying that all of human history, we've basically defined ourselves as kids because we've infantilized our own ability to create better worlds, and that we aren't thinking imaginatively enough. And that's what one of the things I love about the book is it's like a workbook, because it's asking you to stretch your imagination as you read it. Yeah, I mean, there aren't a lot of, I mean, yes, there aren't a lot of history or archaeology books that do that, because history and archaeology start from this other epistemology rooted in the kind of non-Bhaskarian or positivist sense of science that they've just completely shattered. Yeah, it's stuff. Okay, I want to be mindful of time. I see it's for my time 4:03. So if anyone would like to throw in anything else that they have, concluding thoughts. Yeah, Hassan.
Thanks. Yeah, I think once your comment about how other archaeologists approach this march of history, it reminds me of this like quote, I think that Obama quoted Martin Luther, this long arc of justice kind of thing. And I think this whole, I also think about this other idea of modernism, essentially, where we're working towards something like a finality. I think like socialist Marxist theory also works towards this march towards communism or this utopia. So all of our political and economic and technological conceptions that start from the Enlightenment essentially almost force us or coerce us to think about history and time in this sequential way, where we started off from like inferior societies and we picked up the best tools to organize politically, technologically, socially, economically. So as we're progressing, we're only going to get better, and the institutions that are in power in the present are time tested. So they're only going to be tweaked to become better, but there is no significant alteration that can be imagined. And I think we've come to this. It's almost like that. This I think Fukuyama talks about how like there's this end of history, and we're still in this. I think intellectually there's this almost like demise of curiosity or alternative ways of thinking that Graeber is promoting. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is like we need to think about alternatives, as you mentioned. This whole book is essentially about potential alternatives that have existed, but in the time we exist, the last few hundred years are this burden that we carry, that things have to proceed as they have been proceeding into the future, because that's essentially the best we could do. So it's this burden that creates this hopelessness, and I think we need to break through that mold.
Yeah, it's so wonderful what you're saying. That's exactly how it was in Soviet Union, because, you know, by telling us kids that Marx already explained everything, sit quiet, Communist Party is leading us to the paradise, you know, this is just such a bad trick of the power. So all of these people, like, they're fighting, like Fukuyama and Diamond and Harari, they basically all, like, you know, in the 1970s and 80s in Soviet Union, like a part of this Communist Party committee who is just saying, you know, the founder's father already told everything, just sit quiet, don't move. The communists are coming, communism are coming.
We're not there yet, we're getting there.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. So the next chapter, chapter 10, is a big one. It's like 80 pages long, I think. It's why the state has no origins. So there is a lot in that one. I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. All right, take care, everyone. Thanks. Bye.
Bye, everyone.